November 8, 1944. The hills above the Moselle River, eastern France. Dawn breaks cold and gray over a landscape scarred by artillery, where frost clings to shattered trees like the memory of peace. In a hastened foxhole dug into the frozen earth, Private First Class Raymond Ray Kowalski from Buffalo, New York, crouches behind his Browning M2.50 caliber machine gun. His breath forms clouds in the bitter air. Around him, the smell of cordite and damp wool. In the distance, the grinding sound of tank treads, German armor probing the American line for weakness. This was the autumn of 1944, when the Allied advance across Europe had begun to slow, when victory no longer seemed inevitable but earned through blood and cold and the grinding arithmetic of attrition. The German Wehrmacht, bloodied but unbroken, fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland's threshold. Every hedgerow, every river crossing, every frost-hardened hill became a killing ground. For the American forces pushing toward the Rhine, superior firepower was not merely an advantage, it was survival itself. And no weapon embodied that firepower more completely than the Browning M2, the 50 caliber machine gun that could tear through engine blocks, puncture light armor, and shred infantry at ranges exceeding a mile. But firepower meant nothing if the gun fell silent. And the M2, for all its devastating potential, had a fundamental vulnerability: its ammunition feed. The standard procedure, drilled into every machine gunner from basic training through combat, was methodical and unforgiving. The M2 fed from a disintegrating metal belt, each round linked to the next by metal clips that fell away as the gun fired. When 100-round belt ran dry, the gun ceased firing. The gunner's assistant would then connect a new belt to the old, a process requiring precious seconds of exposure, of vulnerability, of silence in moments when silence meant death. In the chaos of combat, when German machine guns answered American fire with their own terrible efficiency, when mortar rounds walked closer with each explosion, those seconds stretched into eternities. Men died in those gaps. Advances stalled. Positions were lost. Ray Kowalski understood this arithmetic of violence. He had learned it at Normandy, where he'd gone ashore on D-Day +3, wading through water still pink with the blood of men who'd landed before him. He'd learned it in the hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a fortress and every German position had to be dug out like a rotten tooth. He'd learned it crossing the Seine, fighting through Lorraine, watching friends transformed into memories between one heartbeat and the next. And he'd learned something else, something the training manuals never taught, that survival in combat required improvisation, adaptation, the willingness to break rules when rules became death sentences. The German gunners expected the pause. Their intelligence briefings, their combat experience, their own understanding of crew-serve weapons, all of it taught them the rhythm of the American 50 caliber. 100 rounds, then silence. 100 rounds, then vulnerability. The MG42 teams positioned on the opposite hillside had been trained to listen for that gap, to recognize that moment of American weakness and exploit it with devastating efficiency. Their own weapon, the dreadful MG42, capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute with a sound like tearing canvas, needed no such pause. Its belt-fed system allowed for continuous fire, limited only by barrel heat. The German gunners had learned to fear the American 50 caliber's power, yes, but they'd also learned to wait for its silence. But Ray Kowalski had spent the previous 3 weeks doing something the manuals never suggested. During the brief respites between combat, while other men wrote letters home or tried to sleep or stared at nothing, Ray had been connecting ammunition belts. Not 2 or 3, but dozens. He'd scrounged every 50 caliber belt he could find, from supply dumps, from damaged vehicles, from positions overrun in previous engagements. He'd connected them with meticulous care, ensuring each link was secure, each round properly seated. His assistant gunner, a kid from Iowa named Tommy Breslin who'd arrived as a replacement after the Vosges Mountains, had thought him insane. "You'll jam the gun," Tommy had said, watching Ray work by candlelight in a barn that smelled of old hay and newer death. "All that weight, all those connections, something's gonna hang up and then we're dead." But Ray had only smiled, his hands never stopping their careful work, and said, "Maybe. Or maybe we'll make those bastards keep their heads down long enough that we don't get dead instead." The attack came with the dawn, as attacks so often did. German infantry, supported by armor, advancing through the morning mist in that peculiar crouch that all soldiers learn. Moving fast but low, seeking cover, knowing that death traveled faster than thought. The American positions opened fire, the familiar symphony of war, the crack of M1 Garens, the slower thump of bars, the sharp bark of carbines. And then Ray Kowalski pressed the butterfly trigger of his M2, and the world transformed into thunder. The 50 caliber rounds, each one as long as a man's hand, each one carrying enough kinetic energy to punch through concrete, poured from the gun in a continuous stream. 50 rounds. The German advance wavered. 75 rounds. Men sought cover, the attack's momentum breaking like a wave against stone. 100 rounds, where the silence should have come, where the German gunners had been trained to expect their opportunity. But the M2 never stopped. 125 rounds. 150. The belt Ray had created, this serpent of brass and steel and cordite, fed smoothly through the gun's mechanism. The barrel began to glow, first red, then orange, then a color that seemed to belong to the sun itself. 200 rounds without pause. 250. The German positions, those carefully prepared fighting holes with interlocking fields of fire, became untenable under the sustained fury of the continuous barrage. What Ray had done was theoretically simple but practically revolutionary. By pre-connecting his ammunition belts, eventually creating a chain of more than 500 rounds, he'd eliminated the gun's fundamental vulnerability. There was no pause. No moment of silence. No opportunity for the enemy to advance or return effective fire. The weight of the belt, which Tommy had feared would cause jams or feeding problems, was managed through careful positioning. Ray had laid the connected belts in a carefully arranged pattern, using ammunition cans to support the weight, ensuring the belt fed smoothly without kinking or twisting. It required preparation, foresight, and a willingness to invest hours of work for minutes of effect. But those minutes in combat meant everything. The German soldiers advancing through the frost that morning had been told what to expect from American forces. They'd been briefed on American tactics, American weapons, American patterns of fire. Their officers, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front, had assured them that the Americans, for all their material abundance, fought by doctrine, by the book, predictably. 100 rounds from the .50 caliber, then silence. That was the pattern. That was the opportunity. But on that November morning, the pattern broke. The .50 caliber that should have gone silent after 100 rounds kept firing. And firing. And firing. The sound of it, that distinctive heavy thump, slower than the German MG42 but so much more powerful, became not a rhythm but a continuous roar, punctuated only by the clinking of spent brass cascading to the frozen ground like lethal rain. In his after-action report, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Ray's platoon commander, wrote with a careful understatement that characterized official military documents, Private First Class Kowalski's modified ammunition feeding procedure resulted in sustained suppressive fire that broke up the enemy attack before it could develop. Recommend this technique be evaluated for broader implementation. But in a letter to his wife, written 3 days later, Webb was more direct: we should all be dead. They had us outnumbered, better positioned, and their attack was well coordinated. But Ray Kowalski did something I'd never seen before. Kept that .50 running for what must have been 3 solid minutes without a pause. I've never seen Germans break like that, just turn and run from a position they should have taken. It wasn't the killing that did it, though God knows the .50 did plenty of that. It was the relentlessness. They couldn't advance, couldn't return fire, couldn't do anything but die or retreat. They chose retreat. The technique spread through the regiment within weeks, passed not through official channels but through that ancient network of soldiers teaching soldiers, the practical wisdom of those who must live with the consequences of their methods. Other gunners began pre-connecting their belts, experimenting with different lengths, different support systems. Some units organized dedicated teams to prepare ammunition during defensive positions, creating stockpiles of extended belts. The official training manuals would eventually be updated, the technique codified and taught at gunnery schools. But in the autumn of 1944, it was still raw and improvised, born not from theory but from the simple desire to stay alive. What the German soldiers experienced that morning was more than tactical defeat. It was a confrontation with a fundamental truth about the enemy they faced. The American war machine, which they'd been told was decadent, soft, reliant on material superiority alone, revealed itself to be something else entirely: adaptive, innovative, willing to break its own rules in pursuit of victory. The German military tradition prized discipline, adherence to doctrine, the perfection of established methods. It was a philosophy that had served them well in the war's early years, when superior training and tactics had compensated for material deficiencies. But against an enemy that combined material abundance with pragmatic innovation, that tradition became a cage. By late 1944, German soldiers had learned to recognize certain sounds that meant death was approaching: the whistle of American artillery, vastly more abundant than their own; the drone of Allied aircraft, flying with impunity through skies the Luftwaffe no longer contested; the rumble of American tanks, diesel-powered and reliable. But the sound that haunted many of them, the sound that appeared in letters home and prisoner interrogations and post-war memoirs, was the sustained fire of the American .50 caliber. It represented something beyond simple firepower. It represented an enemy that could adapt faster than they could respond, that could turn abundance into lethality, that could improvise solutions to problems German doctrine said had no solutions. The barrel of Ray's M2 that morning glowed so hot that it ignited the paint on the gun's receiver. The sustained fire, far beyond what the weapon was designed to endure, should have caused catastrophic failure. A warped barrel, a jammed action, an overheated receiver cooking off rounds uncontrollably. But the gun held. The American abundance that German propaganda mocked, the industrial capacity that could produce weapons with such tolerances, such quality, that they could exceed their designed limits and still function, proved itself in the frozen hills above the Moselle. When the barrel finally needed changing, after more than 400 rounds, Ray and Tommy performed the switch in less than 30 seconds, using asbestos gloves and practice motions learned through repetition. Then the gun roared again, and the handful of German soldiers still attempting to hold their positions finally withdrew. Ray Kowalski survived the war. He was there when the regiment crossed the Rhine, when they drove into Germany proper, when they finally met Soviet forces at the Elbe and the European war ended. He carried his innovation with him, and it carried him, that simple insight that the rules existed to serve survival, not the other way around. After the war, he returned to Buffalo, worked in a steel mill, raised 4 children, rarely spoke about what he'd done. When asked about the war, he'd usually say it was cold and loud and mostly boring, punctuated by moments of terror. Only once in the 1970s, when his grandson asked him to speak at a school about his service, did he mention the belt-feeding technique. "I just wanted the gun to keep running," he said, with a characteristic understatement of his generation. "Seemed like if it kept running, we'd keep living." But that November morning in 1944, what Ray Kowalski demonstrated was a truth larger than tactics, deeper than innovation. The metallic belt feeding through his gun, that serpent of brass and steel, became a symbol of something the totalitarian powers had never understood: that free men, given the tools and the necessity, will adapt, improvise, overcome. Not because doctrine tells them to, but because survival demands it and freedom permits it. The German military machine, for all its vaunted efficiency, was fundamentally rigid, bound by hierarchy, by doctrine, by the belief that proper training and discipline could solve any problem. But Ray Kowalski, a factory worker from Buffalo who'd been a civilian 2 years earlier, had solved a problem the manuals never addressed, not because he was ordered to but because he was free to try. In the decades after the war, military historians would analyze the factors that determined victory: industrial capacity, strategic bombing, naval supremacy, the two-front war. All true. All necessary. But in the frozen hills and shattered towns where the war was actually won, victory came down to moments like that November morning. Moments when one man's ingenuity, multiplied across millions of soldiers, proved more powerful than any doctrine. The ammunition belt, that simple chain of brass and steel, became in Ray's hands what it had always been in potential: not just a means of feeding a gun, but a symbol of the adaptability, the practical innovation, the relentless determination that free societies bring to bear when their survival demands it. The war would grind on for another 6 months. More battles, more deaths, more frozen mornings and desperate fights. But the German soldiers who survived that November attack, who retreated back through the frost-hardened hills with the sound of that unstoppable .50 caliber echoing in their ears, carried with them a truth their propaganda had tried to deny: that they were fighting not just an enemy with more resources, but an enemy that could turn those resources into victory through 10,000 small innovations, 10,000 moments of adaptation, 10,000 soldiers like Ray Kowalski who looked at the rules and said, maybe there's a better way.